There's a website that floated around Facebook a few months ago that recounted the top 5 toys of all time. A top 5 list, my favorite. And so, without further ado, as compiled by Wired Magazine, the top 5 toys that no child should ever be without. Number 1, here we go. Dirt. Cardboard tube. Stick. String. And number 5, the box itself. The 5 greatest toys of all time, indeed. Timeless classics. On a related note, a few weeks ago, my friends Rachel and Aaron, they're right over there, returned home from a conference that they were at, and they showed off some of the toys that they had brought back for their children after their week away. For 3.5-year-old Lily, what did she get? A couple of pens and a pad of paper. For Gabi, what did she win? Cotton balls! Now let's unpack this for a second. First, it clearly shows that Rachel and Aaron know their children pretty well. You put cotton balls in front of Gabi, she squeals with delight. Same thing when you put a pot and a wooden spoon in front of her. Squeal and a lot of noise. And Gabi, she'll draw you a card. She'll draw all of her friends a card, both real and imaginary. But the list from Wired Magazine and our anecdote about cotton balls, I think, tells us a lot more than that. It's more than just a story of Lily and Gabi. It's a story about how, at our most basic states, when we are closer to being unsocialized than socialized, we are most open to ultimate wonder in the world. Case in point. We find joy in the seemingly mundane at these points in our lives. I, in turn, can really only sit back and smile, in some ways wishing I were at that point myself. Children at this age notice sparkles in the ground. They laugh uncontrollably when they hear a funny sound. They witness wonder in the world. Yet we also observe a corollary to what I'll call the cotton ball phenomenon. And that is how we educate our youth. Some of our most basic principles of child rearing are geared specifically to train humans to look outside of themselves, to form a relationship with the outside world. They tell us specifically to look beyond the eye, whether it's the ego within, or whether it's a toy created by Apple, which has an I at the beginning of every name. For example, sharing doesn't seem to be a natural impulse for humans. Yet we condition all children, all humans really, to understand that it is the ideal, the only way to interact with the world. We set limits, because if not, seemingly, children would continue to act in the same way, as if they were the only people in the world. A seemingly trite example: don't speak when your mouth is open. I don't want to see Wacky Mac as it is being chewed. And while you might want to show it to me, that's simply not the way we behave as a family. I would suggest that nearly all of the guidelines that we set are to condition the individual to relate with her surrounding group and ultimately society as a whole. As I've been preparing for this sermon, I've been humming the popular Yom Kippur tune throughout the course of many of the days. Ki anu amecha v'yata Adoneinu anu anecha v'yata b'inu. We are your nation, and you are our master. We are your children, and you are our parent. Parashat Yitro features the birth of the children of Israel as a nation. All of Israel was present at Sinai, those physically there at the time, and those generations into the future, up to this very day. So goes the Midrash. While individuals had communed with God individually up to this point in history, for the first time, God reveals God's self to an entire group, the nation of Israel. All search for meaning ultimately stems from the encountering of the radical presence at Sinai. All contemporary meaning, all transcendence in the present, is an echo of this ultimate revelatory experience. Before we were wandering individual Jews, now, as a nation, encountering covenant with the divine. During Parashat Yitro and Ma'amad Har Sinai, we see precisely this dual mode of child rearing as a nation interacts with God. At Revelation, we see this dialectic between the individual in awe, sheer ecstasy at God's presence, and limit setting of God pushing the individual toward looking outside of himself. God's majesty appears to us, screams to us every time we walk down the street. Yet so often we are cold to the surroundings because of our personal involvements. Sometimes we hear a voice screaming out to us from a burning bush. Other times we don't need that voice in the first place. And still others, we walk along, walking right by, involved in our own essence, in who we are as individuals. Revelation is a human account of God's majesty. We see thunder, we hear lightning. Sensory norms go out the window for an event like this. We can only use the limited human language that we have to describe the sensory majesty that is Revelation. And plus, there's the complementary narrative of Revelation, the revelation of a legal code, of God's commanding presence in history. This law conditions humanity to look outside of itself. It cements a covenant of every person, constantly in relationship as individuals with God, individuals with the rest of humanity, indeed, individuals with the entirety of creation. Law ensures that we are constantly living in relationship. In so many ways, I think back to our dialectic between cotton balls and the rules of sharing. The revelation at Sinai simultaneously mandates and encourages the children of God to cultivate inner wonder to the outside world, and conditions that we as the children of God never be caught inside that self either. Hillel's oft, perhaps overquoted statement comes particularly to mind at this time. Im ein ani li mili k'sh'ani le'atzmi mali. Ras Shai Hel provides a particularly apt translation of this phrase from Pirkei Avot, chapter 1. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Semicolon. But if I am only for myself, what am I? The Jew, Rav Shai suggests, is asked to live in the semicolon between the two questions. The Jew, in fact, is that very semicolon. This is the experience of revelation, of our very lives continuing to this very day, living in the semicolon between ultimate wonder and conditional relationship with the surrounding world. The self versus the self in relationship. The Torah's essence is defined between these poles. It is synonymous with this tension. The tension is an organic system in itself. We are ever wary of treading between the diverging paths, one on the road towards self-righteousness and nihilism, self-righteousness and hedonism, the other toward nihilism. As Jews, as witnesses to continuing revelation, our only option, our only one, is to be the semicolon. Chancellor Arnold Eisen has suggested several times over the past 5 years that before graduating, every rabbinical student should read one particular letter. Well, it's January. It's February, actually. It was January. And we're graduating in May, so I picked it up. This letter, written in 1924 from Franz Rosenzweig to Martin Buber, is self-entitled The Builders. And in it, he suggests two main suggestions for Jewish life in a refinement of his metaphor of Torah as path. First, as Chancellor Eisen suggests, one cannot view the path from the heights, but only walk it. And however far one has walked, one is always on the first lap. Secondly, our goals as educators is to facilitate the journey from the path of Torah learning to the pathlessness of transcendence and communing with God. And we can't skip any steps to get there. Rosenzweig addresses a central trope that has been on my mind every time I enter any room, every time I enter any setting as a teacher. In a world of competing ideals and ideologies, what is our compelling narrative? What is the enduring power of Torah? There are so many options in the world today, a veritable salad bar of ways to quest toward truth. Truth being sold at every street corner with every iPhone app. And in a big way, I'm going into marketing for a career, specifically sales. What is my campaign? What is our campaign for the life orientation that we call Judaism? As he crafted his Lehrhaus in Berlin, Rosenzweig built an institution, an educational platform into the future to navigate the path of Torah, its laws and wonder, to labor upon that path, to move toward pathlessness. In that way, as children of God, he urges all both to be understanders and builders of Torah. As the ad campaign for Lowe's Hardware goes, let's build something together. So why Torah? Because we need stronger safeguards than our instincts. We may do what is in our power to remove obstacles. We can and should make free our ability and power to act. But the last choice is not within our will. It is entrusted to our ability. Earlier this year, I sat with two congregants who had recently separated. And very early into the conversation, the wife said the following: "Rabbi, what I'm really looking for right now is if you could shed any Torah on our situation." Torah learning, in no uncertain terms, is an echo of the unending voice which began from Sinai and echoes unto this very day. It speaks to us at our most vulnerable moments, during the status quo as we're walking down the street, and everything in between, if we condition ourselves to hear this voice. Our roles as educators is to build communities where Torah can be understood, can be lived. Yet through all of this, there's a voice that should be tugging at everyone here. We are not fundamentalists. That in so many ways is the easy way to preach. Torah, the too low, Torah and nothing else. Torah is not the only source of truth in this world. Empirically, we look around and we can see that that's the truth. But our system says as much as well. We recognize that chokhmah, wisdom, simultaneously is not synonymous with Torah. We read in Echa Rabbah, Im yomar lecha adam, chokhmah yesh b'goyim, ta'min lahem. If someone comes up to you and tells you there is wisdom among the non-Jews, yes, of course you believe them. Look around you. There is obviously truth among every human. There's obviously wisdom among every human alive. Not only that, when we encounter someone who is steeped in wisdom, we elevate God's name. We say a bracha when we encounter this person. Baruch shenatan chokhmato l'basar v'adam. Blessed is God who gave from God's wisdom to the flesh and blood. However, im yomar lecha v'goyim Torah yesh lahem al ta'min. However, if they are to tell you that there is Torah among non-Jews, you are not to believe them. We interact dynamically with the outside world, praising God for God's involvement with all of humanity. But we also acknowledge that the Jews have a unique path marching toward truth. We see ever more that a salad bar approach of questing toward pathlessness, just because contemporary American sensibilities might suggest that it be trendy, is not an option for us. As we read about Revelation in this week's parashah, we are abundantly aware both of the utter wonder that we see and of a code of conduct that instructs, of cotton balls and of bedtimes. As educators, we can, and actually we must, ask the question, why Torah? Why Torah? Because it pushes us from path to pathlessness. Our interactions with Revelation mandate that we continuously bear witness to wonder while simultaneously following a code that forces us outside of ourselves. We must live in the semicolon, be the semicolon. The organic system of Torah mandates tension between the self and the self in relationship, specifically because that is the way it was delivered at Har Sinai, as we read it in chapter 20 of Exodus. And that is the message that we must sound forth into the future. That is the echoing call from Sinai, the Kol Gadol, the Lo Yasaf. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chana, Hamidei Chachmim, Rabbi Shalom Ba'olam, Shene'emar, V'chol Banayich, B'mudei Torah, V'rav Shalom Banayich, Al Tikri Banayich, Ela Bonayich. Shalom Rav Lo Avei Toratecha, Ve'en Lamo Michshol, Yi Shalom B'chedlech, Shavah Barmanotayich, L'man Achai V'raya, Dabrana Shalom Bach, L'man Beit Adonai Eloheinu V'achshat Tovlach, Adonai Oz Emo Yiten, Adonai Yivarech, Adamo B'Shalom. We continue on page 13 with Kadish D'Rabbanan. Yikadal v'yikadash me'rabah, Yelmad yivrach yurtei v'yamlit malchutei, v'chayekon v'machon v'chayelachon v'Yisrael, v'agala v'zman karib v'imru amen. V'orach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitrumam v'yinaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal v'shmeid v'shah Leila min kol birkata v'shirata Tushbachata v'nachmata v'miran v'yalma v'imru amen. V'Yisrael v'Rabbanan v'Tamideion v'Kol Tamidei Tamideon v'Kol man v'Yaskim v'Oreita v'Yatradem v'Yipakol atar v'atar v'Yehei l'chon l'chon shlamar rabba v'Fina v'Talkista v'Rakamim v'Chayin arifinu v'Zina v'Vika v'Kana min kadam v'Hom v'Shmaya v'imru amen. Yehei shlamar rabba v'Shmaya Chaim Aleinu ve'al Kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Useh shalom v'rahmah u'barachmah sh'taseh shalom Aleinu ve'al Kol Yisrael. Amen. You may be seated. A couple of thank yous. It's truly an honor to be able to speak words of Torah in front of my teachers, my mentors, and I mean that in the broadest possible characteristic. My teachers in every aspect of life. A couple of specific thank yous. Thank you to Ari Lucas for leading Mincha and also for being a Baal Plukta for the past 5 years, both in Talmud and also in life. Thank you. Thank you to Rabbi Lebo, who was a mentor throughout this process and helped me cultivate these ideas. To my teachers, my friends, my family mentors, my mentors, all of whom cross over in these categories, thank you for being a part of this path, always being there with me, marching me on the path, the first lap at all times, but also pushing me towards pathlessness. And also to my first and best teachers, my parents, Larry and Bets, thank you to all that you have done and all that you continue to do as I hear your echo throughout your life.